everybody. Thank you all so much for joining me today during this very cold season. The best thing I find is to snuggle up with a hot chocolate and listen to some warm winter tales. My name is Róisín and thank you all so much for joining me here today. The first story I have to tell you happened many years ago in a very far off place in Mexico. There lived a little girl named Juanita. And Juanita lived with her parents, her mother and father, her little brother and her little sister. And they were very happy together. They didn't have a lot of money. Her parents were farmers, but they had enough to get by, and most importantly, they had each other. And that was the best of all. And one Christmas, Juanita's favourite time of year, she looked forward to Christmas all year round because during Christmas Eve, the whole village got together to have a Christmas Eve parade where they would all walk around the village carrying candles, singing songs, and they'd each bring a gift that was handmade by themselves that they would place under the Christmas tree. And the next day, all the children of the village would get to open a gift for themselves. And Juanita had been looking forward to this for a very long time. Unfortunately, this one Christmas in particular, both her parents fell sick on the run up to Christmas. They were so unwell that they didn't have the energy to go out and work in the farm like they usually did. They lay in bed all day and all night. And all the responsibility fell on Juanita to keep the house going. She nursed her sick parents, bringing them soup and water, fresh bedclothes, anything she could do to help them, whilst also taking care of her little brother and sister, making them their dinners, bringing them to school, while going to school herself, and also in her spare time, she had to help out in the farm. And poor Juanita was so tired, and she kept hoping and wishing that her parents would recover in time for Christmas Eve and the parade. But as time ticked on, she began to realise that that might not be the case. And so she decided to get to work on making the handmade gift that she would leave under the Christmas tree. But this was the first time Juanita had ever attempted to make the Christmas gift all by herself. After all, she was only a child still, and she thought to herself, well, maybe it would be lovely to weave a great big blanket. It would be so colourful, she thought to herself. It would be like a rainbow blanket. And so she began to work on her yarn. But there were so many different colours, it all became tangled until eventually she had to give up. Without her father's help, she was no good at all. And then she thought to herself, well, maybe she could make some lovely little leather boots for one of the village children. That might be nice. But the leather was so tough, she couldn't push the needle through, and without her mother's help, it was no use, and she had to give up on that too. And in no time at all, Christmas Eve was upon them, and all the people of the village gathered together in a line, walking up and down the village, singing songs, making merry, holding their candles in the parade. When poor Juanita, without a gift to give, felt she couldn't join in the festivities at all. And instead, she hung back by the bushes and watched all her friends and neighbours having such a lovely evening. And she began to cry. When all of a sudden, she heard a very kind voice behind her. "Excuse me," the voice said. "You wouldn't happen to be Juanita, would you?" And she turned to the voice and she saw a very kind old man with very welcoming eyes, slightly wrinkled around the edges. He had a great big belly and rosy cheeks and a long white beard. And she said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "I come with a message for you, Juanita. I want to let you know that your parents will be well again very soon, and you won't have anything to worry about anymore." "Now don't be sad," he said. "Hurry along, your brother and sister are at the parade. Why don't you go and join them?" "I can't," she said. "I tried as hard as I could, but I wasn't able to make a gift for the Christmas tree without the help of my parents, and I can't very well show up empty-handed." And the kind old man looked at her and he said, "Juanita, don't you know, the best part of giving a gift is the fact that you have given it. That's what makes it so special. It doesn't have to be perfect or particularly well made. As long as it's given with love, anything you give will be special." And Juanita thought, well, maybe you're right. And she quickly looked around for something that she might be able to give as a gift when she saw overgrowing out of the ground were these thick green weeds. She pulled them up out of the earth and she turned towards the old man. "Will these do?" she said. But when she turned around, he was nowhere to be seen, as though he had disappeared. Oh well, she thought. She wasted no time. She ran into the village square, joined the parade, singing and dancing. She was the last in the line when finally she walked up to the town square and very carefully placed her gift under the Christmas tree. And all the villagers were watching her. They began to whisper, "What gift is Juanita giving at all? Is that weeds?" they said to one another. But Juanita paid no attention. Keeping in mind the words of the kind old man, she placed them down, bowed her head, and closed her eyes. And when she opened her eyes again, she looked down at the weeds, and sitting there on top of them was a beautiful, shining red star, the most beautiful flower Juanita had ever seen in her whole life. And all of her friends and neighbours gasped. "Oh my goodness," they said, "look how beautiful the plant Juanita brought is." And when they stood up and looked around, they realised all the trees and plants were topped with the same beautiful, shining red star, the most beautiful plant any of them had ever seen before. And all of a sudden, Juanita realised her special gift had been transformed. And from that day on, every year at Christmas time, that very same plant would sprout up around the village in her hometown in Mexico. And the people of the village became to rely on that beautiful plant to grow every year at Christmas time. And they called it the Flor de Buena Noche, which means the Christmas Eve flower. And today, you might find one of those exact plants in your home at Christmas time, because that tradition spread all over the world. Even still to this day, we use that very same plant to decorate our homes and towns at Christmas time. And that plant is the poinsettia plant. And that was the story of Juanita and the very first ever poinsettia. The second chilling winter tale I have for you all today happened many, many years ago in Germany. There lived a little girl with her mother and father in a very small village near the woods. And she was so happy. She loved her parents so much. The three of them were best friends. They didn't have a lot of money, but they really didn't want for anything because they had the most important thing of all. They had each other, and they loved each other so much. And the one thing the little girl's parents always told her was that no matter how little they may have, it was always important to help in any way that you could. If ever she were to meet anyone who was less fortunate than she was, her parents always encouraged her to give what little she had to help make their lives easier. And that kindness was something that stuck with the little girl all throughout her life until she was a grown woman. But still, when she was a little girl, one winter, something very sad happened, and her parents died tragically in an accident. And the poor little girl was left all alone. And One night, on Christmas Eve, the little girl built herself a fire, snuggled up down beside it, and thought of her parents, when all of a sudden there was a great big loud knocking on the door. And the little girl went up and answered it, and there she saw, standing before her, was her parents' landlord. And he looked down at the little girl with a sad look in his eyes, and he said, "I'm so sorry to do this to you on Christmas Eve of all nights, but I'm afraid I have some bad news. You see, your parents never paid up the last 2 months' rent, and I'm afraid I can't afford to let you stay here without getting any money." And of course the little girl didn't have anything to her name. She was only a child after all, and so she said, "Okay, I suppose it's best I leave." And she looked around and she realised she didn't even have any belongings. And so she closed the door of her childhood home, the only home she'd ever known. And with nothing but the coat on her back and the hat on her head, she walked away. And as she closed the gate behind her, her neighbour came running up. "Oh wait," she said, "please hold on. I wish I had something more to give you," she said, "but this is all I have to spare." And in her hands she had a big loaf of freshly baked bread. She handed it to the little girl and she said, "At least I know you won't be hungry tonight." And the little girl thanked her, wished her a happy Christmas, and off she went on her way, munching the bread as she walked. And she began to wonder to herself where on earth she could possibly go to rest her head for the night. She had no money after all. She couldn't afford to go to a hotel. She had no friends or family in the area she could stay with. And as she was thinking about this, a little boy, not much older than herself, approached her. "Excuse me," he said, "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wonder, could you share some of your bread? You see, I'm so hungry. I don't even remember the last time I ate." And the little girl looked at him, and his skin had gone grey and pasty. His arms were so thin and frail. She couldn't bear the thought of this boy going hungry. She wondered how long it had been since he had eaten himself, and she looked down at her bread that she'd already eaten some of already, and she said, "You know what? I've had my fill. Please help yourself to the rest of this." "Oh, thank you," the little boy said. "Thank you so much." She wished him well. "Happy Christmas," she said, and off she went on her way through the village, thinking to herself where possibly she could go. When then she remembered the woods on the edge of town. They had great big trees with long overhanging branches that might shelter her from the wind. That might be a good idea, she said, and as she went on her way towards the woods, an old man approached her. "Excuse me, little girl," he said. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I wonder, could you spare that hat on your head? It looks so lovely and warm, and you see, I'm so old. And I'm frozen to the bone. I can barely feel my ears," he said. "I don't know if I'll make it through the night, but you're young and strong, you'll be okay." And the little girl looked at him. She couldn't bear the thought of his ears falling off with frostbite, so she took the hat off her head, she gave it to him, wished him well, and off she went on her way, her teeth chattering ever so slightly. And just as she was about to step foot into the woods, a final child approached her, a little girl about her own age. And she said, "Excuse me, but would you maybe be able to spare that jacket on your back? I'm so cold," she said. "I've never owned a jacket before in my life, and I'm so small. I bet that jacket I could use it as a blanket." And the little girl looked at her, and she thought to herself, "I've already given away my bread and my hat. This coat is the last thing I have to my name. What difference does it make?" she said. And so she took her coat off her back, handed it to the little girl, and wished her well. And off she went with her bare arms and her bare head and her empty tummy rumbling. Shivering in the cold, she walked through the woods in search of a place to rest her head for the night. When finally she came across a great big tree, and she sat down at the base of the trunk, and she gathered up all the fallen leaves around her, pushed them up towards her, and held her knees together to make a makeshift blanket under the leaves. And as she gazed up at the stars shining brightly above her, she thought to herself, really, how lucky I am to have such a beautiful sight to look at tonight. The only thing she wished was that her parents were there to savour the view with her. And as she was looking up at the sky, she noticed a single star falling. "Oh, a shooting star," she said. "I've never seen one of them before in my life." But before she even had a chance to make a wish on the star, she noticed another star falling, and then another one, and another one, until no time at all the stars sparkling above her were falling down all around her. And when the last star had fallen, she crept out from beneath her blanket of leaves and reached down to the spot where it had landed and picked it up to get a closer look. She couldn't believe her eyes, but there on the ground it wasn't a star at all, but a big, thick chunk of pure, solid silver. And when she looked around at the other stars, she realised that they were all chunks of silver and gold. She gathered them all around as quickly as she could, and as she held them all in her arms more than she could count, she realised this was more money than she had ever seen in her life. More money than any one person could ever need for a lifetime. When all of a sudden she looked at her hands, and they were covered in lovely, warm, woolly mittens, and her head was covered in the nicest, softest cashmere hat, and around her neck was wrapped a lovely, warm, snuggly scarf. And from that day on, the little girl never wanted for anything ever again. She always had a lovely warm bed to sleep in, and a roof over her head, and her belly was always full. But even still, no matter what, if ever she came across anyone in need, anyone less fortunate than she was always happy to lend a helping hand. And that was the story of the very special Christmas Eve Star Bunny. I really hope you enjoyed those Christmas winter stories. Thank you all so much for joining me. Keep warm and enjoy the festive season.